I'm so glad to see as many people as I do. I commend you all for being here this morning. Our passage this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 21 to 35. I will read it, and then we will go through it together. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive someone who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Jesus answered, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. The servant fell on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay back everything.' The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay you back.' But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. 'You wicked servant,' he said, 'I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?' In his anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should be paid back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat you, each of you, unless you forgive a brother or sister from your heart." We live in a time in which the virtue of forgiveness is praised selectively, when the value of renouncing revenge is confined to those cases when the perpetrator in question is one we empathize with. But it's dismissed as callous and cowardly when the perpetrator in question is the one we already hold hatred in our hearts for. Forgiveness in our time is perceived to be a virtuous luxury of the saint, the highest moral calling only achievable by some, but is in no way a necessary binding moral imperative for everyday wrongdoing done to people on both the social and political level. In our time, the proposal that the victim of a sin should forgive the perpetrator already appears to be putting the moral onus on the wrong party. For our immediate instinct is that the perpetrator is the one who should exhibit guilt, atone, and make amends. Finally, in our time, forgiveness is viewed as a way to avoid harder questions of justice, as a way to give permissive license to the perpetrator to continue about their way as if nothing happened at all. Forgiveness is only viewed as a possibility upon the condition that the guilty party admit their guilt. Without their acknowledgement of the wrong they had done, forgiveness is futile, because who else would it matter to if the forgiven party doesn't believe they needed it in the first place? And they continue to act as if they had nothing to repent of. For the first of these, of how we selectively praise forgiveness, many an example can be drawn upon, but one that happens a lot in my world, in the world of young adults, is when relationships begin to fall apart. So let's say there's a guy and a girl, and the guy cheats on the girl, and then she forgives him and takes him back. All the guy friends are like, oh, that's good of her, like at the end of the day, he's a really good guy, and she saw past this one thing, and she's really great for forgiving him. Whereas the friends of the girl, they're all thinking, doesn't she know that once a cheater, always a cheater? So here, forgiveness is only praised because they already empathize with the party that's guilty. Forgiveness is not praised because it is a virtuous act, but because we want to see the party we love and empathize with go unpunished. A feature of our parable this morning that is so interesting in light of this way we selectively praise forgiveness is that we are given no basis on which to empathize or express hatred toward the man who was in massive debt. Was he in massive debt because he spent it all on food and prostitutes, or because he gave all his money to the poor? Because he was lazy in paying it back, or because the Romans decided to tax him a little higher that year? We're given no explanation as to why this man is in the massive debt that he is in the first place. Because the virtue of forgiveness is not praised here because the king is able to empathize in any way with the one who owes him. Forgiveness is not praised because of the moral standing of the one who is guilty. Here, a central point about forgiveness missed in our casual understanding of it. Forgiveness is not a polite gesture in response to the reality that the person is really morally overall good and, they just messed up this one time. Forgiveness is not saying, oh, it's no big deal, or, well, I understand the circumstances in which you were under. No. In the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he says, forgiving is not forgetting. It's actually remembering, and not using your right to hit back. Forgiveness is not what you hope will happen in the case of your child, but not of your enemy. It is when you recognize that your enemy is somebody's child. Forgiveness is not conditional based upon the wrong did or your relationship to the perpetrator and victim, but is based upon the recognition that whatever the wrong did, or whatever the relationship, forgiveness is unconditionally necessary. Now to our second misunderstanding, that forgiveness is a luxury but not a necessity. When the shooting of 9 black people in Charleston, South Carolina occurred not too long ago, many were perplexed and bewildered, perhaps none so much as those who believed that racism was over. But what really struck people was when the family members of the victims stared into the face of Dylan Roof in the courtroom and forgave him. Their right, according to the system of justice, was to call for the death penalty versus execution. For some in the non-Christian community, they would look upon this as bizarre and strange, and perhaps even as an act of extraordinary saintliness, but certainly not something to be expected. However, if you ask the church members, there's not a single doubt that they would refer to the teachings of Christ as their basis for why they would forgive at all. We often think of forgiveness as an act that can only be done when the offense is minor. If somebody accidentally steps on your foot, it'd be pretty petty not to forgive them. But when we think of much larger offenses, like murder or terrorism, we understandably view the lack of the ability to forgive as part of the justifiable anger that the victim feels. It would seem just a stretch of the imagination to view forgiveness as something that was commanded them to do, because why would it? Here, another feature of our parable comes to light when we consider the economic context of first century Palestine under the rule of the Roman Empire and how an agrarian-based economy works. See, Jesus in this parable, he speaks of a king's relationship to his workers. And we should not immediately assume we know everything about how this kind of relationship is configured. When we think of monarchs, we think of someone's rule that's oppressive. And that's often because they were. But in agrarian-based societies, the monarch had an interest, however slight, in the economic welfare of his subjects. Richard A. Horsley, in his work Jesus and the Spiral of Violence, argues that because monarchs of independent nations were dependent on the production of the peasants, both in food and in taxes, in order to construct all the buildings and everything else that they would have needed, they were interested, at least a little bit, in the welfare of their peasants, because if the peasantry couldn't produce, then the king couldn't use. Interestingly, furthermore, Horsley writes, the principal mechanism through which the peasantry could be destroyed was indebtedness. Because of bad harvests or unusual demands for tribute, taxes, or tithes, already marginal peasant families would fall into debt. Then failure to pay the debt would lead to one or more family members becoming debt slaves, and finally to loss of land. The greatest threat to peasants, and probably their greatest fear, was falling heavily and hopelessly into debt. If you've ever been a student, you feel that one right in the gut. So when we come to our parable, and the king first proposes that the servant sell his wife and children, he's not in the context suggesting anything outrageous or unheard of. He's merely giving the standard answer in that kind of economy. Due to the lack of technological and financial environmental security, if you have to pay debt, then you sell your family members in order so that they can work to pay off that debt. So when the servant begs the king to have patience because he'll be able to pay it back, the king pities him because he knows that he'll never be able to pay it back. And in the meantime, he's lost a worker. And furthermore, if he treats his servant this way, how shall he be treated when it comes time to make an account? So when we ask why forgiveness is a necessity, it is because Jesus understands that a justice based just upon retribution won't ever achieve true justice. Because somehow the end of the perpetrator and the end of the victim are bound up. The king forgives his servant not only for the sake of his servant, but for his own sake. Forgiveness is not only a wished-for thing from the perpetrator facing possible punishment. It's a necessity on the part of the victim. Because how the victim will respond to the perpetrator will determine in some way how the victim will be treated in the situation when they themselves are the perpetrator. Forgiveness is not made only as a morally virtuous response, but it is made out of the deep, simple conviction that you would treat others the way you want to be treated. If the way you don't want to be treated when you're brought to account for the things you have done is to be excluded from society and to have retribution brought upon your head, but to wait in expectation in the hope that you will receive forgiveness and that justice can be found beyond the exaction of retribution, then you should not withhold forgiveness from others. It is this that has brought us to our third misunderstanding, that of, is not asking the victim to forgive putting the onus on the wrong party. Forgiveness is a necessity, and if it is, then when you are faced with something heinous, it has to be that the victim must forgive the perpetrator. And it is at this point when we feel within our bones something amiss. Simple everyday example. Say a friend of yours borrows a book, and while in their possession, whether by accident or by one of their lovely children, it is damaged. The book from your childhood is returned to you by the borrower, but a page is ripped out. The book meant a lot to you. It has an immense sentimental value to you. And now someone says that you must forgive the person who borrowed the item for his or her carelessness. But you, the owner of the item, have lost something irreplaceable. And you say, yeah, but what about me? Should not the person try to replace the book or try to make some kind of amends? We feel that when the victim is asked to do something beneficial for their perpetrator, that is asking too much. Asking the victim to summon the goodwill to forgive their perpetrator is almost the burden of a second punishment. Oh, I have to suffer and forsake the right I have to punish them. And sometimes the victim may have nothing left but the right to punish. And asking them to give that up feels like asking them to give up the only power that they have. It is here where we come upon something very difficult to hear, especially when we are in the position of the victim. There is power in being the victim. There is a power in being able to hold someone's debt over his or her head for as long as you can. Even more so, this power is so strong that we even hold grudges for things that were not even done to us, long after the person who was the victim forgave the perpetrator. For instance, Pope Francis right now is beloved by a lot of people, but not everyone was so enamored with him when he came on the scene. From roughly 1974 to 1983, Argentina was engaged in what was known as a dirty war. Because the military government of Jorge Rafael Videla was sponsoring terrorism against its own dissidents, leading to torture, death, and exile. And during this time, Jorge Bergoglio, the young man on the left, our Pope Francis now, was provincial superior of the Jesuit order in Argentina. During this time, 2 Jesuit priests who were under Bergoglio were tortured because of their alleged connections to communist groups. And despite much else that Bergoglio was doing to protect others from the dictatorship, some have argued that he did not do enough to protect these 2 priests. So initially, some people were saying, aha, see? He's not all he's cracked up to be. He let these 2 priests suffer under his watch without intervening to help them. What is less known is that one of the priests later in life discussed this with Bergoglio and forgave him. And despite this, many people will still hold this over his head, even though one of the victims forgave him for it. And why? Because there's power in being able to hold a moral judgment over the head of a moral example. It is the power of a grudge, the power of being an innocent victim that needs to be exposed, because it is the love of retribution. And no matter how much we may sympathize with the victim's call, we need to realize that the debt that they are asking will never be satisfied. What in justice is called retribution is in reality called revenge. And when we limit our notion of justice to simple retribution, to what is owed, we end up giving license to ourselves for the most heinous of crimes. Here we can have a little thought experiment with our own parable. What if the king did not forgive his servant? What if the king decided to exact what he was owed? The payment the servant of the king in our parable was in debt for was 100,000 talents. It's difficult to calculate such an amount, but in present-day terms, one scholar has suggested that given the amount of time it would have taken to earn that money and the equivalent of some present-day minimum wages, it would equal 200,000 years of work and the equivalent of $7.04 billion. So in his case, the debt was not repayable. So now if the king tried to exact this repayment, it's not with the real hope of any kind of closure. It's not like, oh, well, if we got that guy for doing that thing to us, then everything will be okay. Everything will just be even. We're okay. No, because it's the pleasure that he would gain by exacting this revenge that would be the most perverse kind. The onus on the victim to forgive is necessary so that the victim does not succumb to the lust to seek revenge. Finally, we are brought to our fourth. How forgiveness is not a permissive license to the perpetrator to continue doing what they had done. What if they weren't really filled with regret and continued to act as if they had nothing to repent of? Journalist Jeremy Scahill writes the following story in his book, Dirty Wars. I'm just going to prep you ahead of time. It's a very intense story. You will see how it will work in, but it's very intense. So just brace yourselves. On the night of February 12, 2010, in Gardez, Afghanistan, Mohammed Daoud Shahrabuddin was celebrating the name of his son. Then they felt a disturbance, and they thought the Taliban was coming to attack them. So they went outside, and immediately Mohammed was shot and killed, followed by several other family members, 7 all in total, with 2 pregnant women. It wasn't the Taliban. It was U.S. soldiers. After they had finished searching the house, the soldiers pulled out knives to dig the bullets out of the bodies of the women to remove all traces of what they had done. The head of the household, who was left alive, said that the soldiers raided their home because the soldiers thought there were 50 Taliban there, but there were none, and many were government employees. Mohammed Sabir, another one of the men left alive, told Scahill, "I didn't want to live anymore. I wanted to wear a suicide jacket and blow myself up among the Americans. And my brother and father wouldn't let me. I wanted jihad against the Americans." After much cover-up and debate over the next few months, Admiral William McRaven, who was the commander responsible for the raid, paid a visit to the family. When some of the family members were alerted of this, they considered killing him. But the local imam admonished them to listen and show hospitality to him instead. When the convoy rolled up, they loaded up a sheep from their vehicle and prepared to sacrifice the sheep as part of an Afghan ritual known as nawate, when you offer a sheep in front of someone's house to ask for their forgiveness. The head of the household invited them in. McRaven began talking to the head of the household about the difficulties of being a warrior and similarities between Christianity and Islam, and said, "We have the same God. He is a God who shows great love and compassion." He further apologized and gave them $30,000 as compensation. And while the media reported that the head of the household accepted this apology, he told Scahill, "I would not trade my sons for the whole kingdom of the United States. Initially, we were thinking that Americans were the friends of Afghans, but now Americans are our enemy." Now, while we may disagree with the exact way he said that, it's hard not to empathize with that. And if I were to speculate as to why he refuses to forgive these soldiers, Part of it is definitely the power that comes with having revenge, but there's also a realization of his, a genuine one that we feel all the time, and why we hesitate to offer forgiveness. See, for him, it's connected to the realization that not only were these Americans not really regretful of what they had done, after all, they tried to cover it up and blame it on other people, but also in their act of forgiveness, the head of the household knew that these soldiers had no intention of repenting of these acts. And to have offered them forgiveness in that moment would have been like saying, it's okay, keep doing what you're doing. And this is why it's so difficult for many of us to forgive others, because we have a sense that if we were, then this behavior, this destructive behavior that they inflicted upon others wouldn't stop. It would just free their mind and conscience, and you could just continue on. And is this not exactly what happens to the servant in our parable? He has been forgiven his massive, incalculable debt, and yet turns around and chokes one of his servants over what amounts to roughly $12,000. He has been forgiven, and yet chooses to go back into a justice system of pure retribution and exaction, pay back what you owe. And why? The servant, when the king forgave him, thought of it as a cleaning of the slate, a fresh start, a reset. But what forgiveness does, and what it's supposed to do, is break that system entirely. It doesn't clean the slate, it breaks the slate. It's not a license to keep on going. It redefines what going is all about. We all know what it's like when someone receives your forgiveness, not as the first step of making amends or being reconciled, but just a license to keep on going. Their conscience is like, good, oh, okay, now I can sleep again at night. And then those same people, when they decide to decline the freedom of forgiveness and choose to go back into this system of revenge, they forsake themselves. Because what recourse do you have against retribution coming back to you if you have rejected forgiveness? This is why the author of the book of Hebrews, he talks about if you reject Christ's atoning sacrifice for you, there is no forgiveness left because you rejected the idea of forgiveness. And if you go right back to it, what recourse do you have? There isn't any other recourse. Jesus' words at the end of this parable, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive a brother or sister from your heart." It's not an arbitrary punishment put at the end of the thing. In the words of N.T. Wright in his book, Evil and the Justice of God, he writes, "The faculty we have for receiving forgiveness and the faculty we have for granting forgiveness are one and the same. If we open the door on one, we shall open the door on the other. If we slam the door on the one, we slam the door on the other." Whatever the wrong, whatever our relationship, the perpetrator should be forgiven. Whoever the perpetrator, whoever the victim, forgiveness is needed because how we treat one another exhibits how we wish to be treated and how we will be treated. When the responsibility of the perpetrator, the victim has a responsibility to forgive so that they will not succumb to this false, self-destructive allure of power that comes with the right to bring revenge. Whatever the response of the perpetrator to their forgiveness, whether ungratefully continuing in sin or inspired to free others from his or her retribution, we should forgive 70 times 7, as God had his people, with the hope that they may be reconciled. And if you are here this morning and you have not known what the forgiveness from God looks like, or know what forgiveness from others looks like, and wish to know how God himself forgave humanity so that this entire system that we lock into can be broken, I encourage you to come and speak to me or someone else that you trust and talk to and learn the message of the gospel. But now I'd like to invite our worship team back up to lead us in our closing song.